Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Peter Lushtinets. Thanks, Peter. Hello, Penguinauts! I'm the Beardy Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. We begin today's episode in mid-1965, with Nikita Kerman being deposed as first Secretary of the Soviet Union, due to the highly publicized failure of the Rodina 4 lunar mission and the loss of two brave cosmonauts, Pavel and German Kerman. His replacement, Leonid Kerman, has little enthusiasm for the space program and has refused to approve any further funding for the Rodina missions beyond the two boosters already under construction. With the moon race looking all but lost, faith in Sergei Kerman's Kaputnik Design Bureau has been shattered, and Vladimir Kerman's rival Kelome Bureau has been given approval to begin work on the N1 successor, a super heavy derivative of the highly successful UR-500, which won the race to lunar orbit. Meanwhile, the US Trinity program is on schedule, and a test of the full lunar stack in low Earth orbit is successfully completed on the 3rd of May. A mere week later, Trinity 2 successfully reaches orbit on its first step towards completing a lunar orbit test of the command, service, and lunar modules. Coincidentally, the Soviet Union's very own lunar orbit test mission, Rodina 5, is due to be launched the very next day. Now, Leonid Kerman has shifted the priorities of the space program from peaceful exploration for propaganda victories to countering the US militarization of space. To this end, permanent outposts in orbit and on the moon are to be constructed, and work on an answer to the US Air Force's dinosaur space plane, codenamed Spiral, is to begin immediately. But first, we need to fly Rodina 5. We have two more rockets after this one, and then we completely run out of money. So we have to get these right. Otherwise, we are actually going to go bankrupt as a space program. Now, we have two new cosmonauts on the mission today. This is Anastasia, and if you've seen For All Mankind, you might know what her destiny is. But we also have Felix, who is the first Kerbal who is part of the Intercosmos program. He is from the Hungarian People's Republic, and Felix Kerman is a scientist named by Starch, who is one of my dear Emperor Penguin tier patrons. For some reason, Starch is the only person who submitted a name for the Intercosmos program. They were quite surprised that they were the first. If you're an Emperor or King Penguin tier, of which there are quite a few of you, get suggesting names, because we're going to need quite a few new Kerbals in the coming episodes. But German was actually our only scientist Kerbal, and it's rather important we have a scientist on this mission because we have a lot of experiments that we want to do in orbit around the moon, particularly while he is waiting for Anastasia to finish testing the LK lander. Now, this time, thankfully, we have a flawless launch of the N1 Slava launch vehicle. We have replaced the engines on stage 3 with NK-31s, which have two ignitions, so we do have relight capability in case one fails, but on this particular launch, we don't end up needing it. And Rodina 5 and the entire L3 lunar stack is safely in orbit and ready to begin the translunar injection. Now, Trinity 2 is already on its way to the moon, doing a lunar broadcast right now. They are a day ahead of us, but the prime launch window from Baikonur was a day later. We're at a high inclination, so we have very limited times that we can launch and actually stay within the Delta V budget of this launch vehicle. So we are a little bit behind them, but we're basically neck and neck. This is crazy. We're actually launching two crewed missions to the moon at the same time. I remember thinking this might be a possibility when we did the Sevier lunar orbit mission and the Gemini lunar orbit mission, but they didn't end up coinciding. There was a particular Umbrella Academy meme of of 5 and I believe Elliot Page now, isn't it? Yes. I haven't seen a third season of Umbrella Academy, but I believe they actually changed their character's name to reflect them coming out as trans in real life, which is really, really lovely. I think that's a really, really respectable thing for them to have done. I haven't seen it, but there's there's a scene in the second season where they're driving past each other in cars looking very confused. I'm sure people are going to recreate that meme with Rodina 5 and Trinity 2. Regardless, once we reach high space above the Earth, we do our own lunar orbit broadcast, and Felix is seen, the first cosmonaut from the Hungarian People's Republic, performing all sorts of experiments and having fun in the orbital module. However, a few days into flight, and shortly after beginning the second lunar broadcast, things start going wrong. A propellant valve in the Block D attitude control system gets stuck open, causing the entire L3 complex to start rotating dangerously fast. Now, we do activate the ACS on the Soyuz, and that's able to counteract it to an extent until it runs out of propellant, but this was pretty alarming, and I didn't script or fake this. The craft just randomly got attacked by the Kraken, and some phantom force started it spinning faster and faster, and the G meter started rising, and I started panicking. Thankfully, shortly after we burnt all the fuel on Block D, I did quick save and quick load, and that seemed to fix things, and Anastasia is able to bring the spacecraft under control. But that was nerve-wracking. That was a bit of a Neil Armstrong Gemini mission moment. It starts spinning uncontrollably. It would certainly be kind of awkward if we spent all of our ACS fuel and Trinity 2 had to come rescue the crew of Rodina 5. I mean, that would be pretty cool, an international lunar orbit rescue mission. This is, in fact, one of perhaps very few times when that might actually even be possible. But regardless, that would be a pretty big embarrassment for the Soviet Union. And yeah, the space program's already on pretty thin ice with the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Leonid Kerman. And he's currently favouring the Kelami Design Bureau, which I know is pronounced Sholomi, I believe, in reality, but I put a K on it because, well, you got to, haven't you? It's Kerbal Space Program. And the OKB1, OKB, you know, the different actual names for them are a bit lame, so I thought Kaputnik was a fun name for Sergei Kerman, aka, you know, Sergei Korolev from Reality's Design Bureau, because, well, Sputnik and Kaput. People, like, when I first said that in the first episode, like, you realize Kaput means things are going wrong, right? And I'm like, yes, that's the joke. .jpeg, that is the point. I thought it was funny anyway. Maybe it isn't, but it made me chuckle when I thought of that name for a design bureau, and well, we've certainly been living up to that name in the past few months with our string of N1 launch failures. It's astonishing, actually, how close the moon race is at this point. We are neck and neck. We have 2 lunar orbit missions happening at exactly the same time, and we don't script any of this. This is just us playing the game and racing for milestones, and this is how close it is. I just think that's astonishing, particularly with Test Light failing my N1s. Without that, the N1 would be ridiculously overpowered as a launch vehicle, considering how cheap and fast to build it is. But yeah, the reliability of those engines really has kicked us in the teeth in the last episode. But now with the new upgraded engines, it seems to be a reliable workhorse. Not that we have the money to build any more for the foreseeable future. I think we'll probably do the 2 landing missions, assuming both of them actually go to plan, and then we'll probably not build any more N1s. I think I'll wait until we have the Hydrolox engines we need for the N2, and in the meantime we do have the engines for the UR700, so that's what I do plan to get working on. But we'll need a whole new launch complex if we want to use the UR700 RD270M engines, which use pentaborane, which we actually covered recently in a spacecraft propulsion module at uni, and the lecturer was like, yeah, the Soviets used pentaborane as a fuel, and fluorine, which we do also have access to, until they decided this is a ridiculously stupid and dangerous idea. Regardless, Rodina 5 has been in orbit for a few days now, performing synoptic terrain and weather photography. I'm not entirely sure what weather there is to photograph around the moon. Perhaps they're photographing the plumes of electrically charged dust that you do get being ejected from the lunar surface. But after completing our experiments, it is then time for Anastasia to step out the airlock and make the leap across to the LK lander. Anastasia spends about one orbit of the moon just checking out the LK systems, starting the habitat, making sure that the CO2 scrubber is running, and various other checklist items before beginning the descent. Now, the near side of the moon isn't actually lit by the sun at the moment, and it's actually more important for us to be able to see the surface to practice this descent. So we are on the far side of the moon, but thanks to our communications network, we still have continuous, albeit slightly longer time-lagged, communication with Anastasia from the ground. And she begins her descent to the surface. Now we're performing a similar-ish descent to what Apollo 10 did. We're going on a suborbital trajectory, burning Block D as our descent stage. And once we're within about 100 meters per second of the surface, then we're going to abort and head back up into orbit. And it's pretty important that we test this abort procedure in case something does go wrong in the actual landing attempt. But Anastasia can't help but look out the window and see how tantalizingly close the lunar surface is. She's 240,000 miles from the Earth. If she chose to disobey orders and go for a landing, she's certain she could make it. And for an agonizingly long moment, she gazes at the stage command. Right on schedule, Anastasia decouples Block D and begins the abort procedure back up into orbit. But she can't help but wonder what might have been if she had disobeyed orders. Of course, Trinity 2's mission profile is widely publicized. There is absolutely no landing attempt to be made. We could have gone for a landing. We could have been first on the lunar surface. Really, the only thing that stopped us is the gentleman's agreement that we have with N9 to perform a certain number of prerequisite missions. But really, if we hadn't had that agreement in place, he almost certainly would have landed a day before us. So we can't be too upset about it, but man, that was a real Ed Baldwin moment there. Just, we got within 15 kilometers of the surface. We could have touched down, we had enough fuel, everything was going perfectly. It's almost infuriating how close we were, but it is more important for us to get the engine data and practice the procedures to make sure that the actual landing attempt on Rodina 6 has every chance of success. And that will actually be on the near side of the moon. That's another constraint we have on that landing. It has to be in a lunar launch window where the near side is properly illuminated, because it's pretty unlikely that the first landing attempt on the surface of the moon would be on the far side, subject to dodgy communications and even more time lag. Regardless, Anastasia now heads back on up into orbit and begins the rendezvous procedures back with the lunar Soyuz. In fact, the crew have affectionately named their two spacecraft. The LK has been christened Dave, which was the engineer, or should I say, the viewers, you guys' favourite name for the entire lunar program. So I thought I would give it a little nod, and Starch did also specifically request that I name it Dave. So the LK is named Dave, and the lunar Soyuz is named Golly, short for Goliath. Even though it's really not that much larger than the LK, it just seemed an appropriate name for the partner spacecraft. And it's not all that unrealistic to have silly names for spacecraft on practice missions. After all, in reality, the Apollo 10 CSM was called Charlie Brown, and the lunar module was called Snoopy. So there's nothing wrong with the crews having a little bit of fun, affectionately naming their spacecraft. But I know exactly what the lunar Soyuz and LK will be named on the Rodina 6 mission. And I also know the crew which are going to be on it. Yuri, the first Kerbal ever to orbit the Earth, is going to be by far the most qualified pilot for the job when it comes to piloting the lunar Soyuz. And Alexei Kerman, the first Kerbal ever to perform a spacewalk, is going to be piloting the LK and doing the rather dangerous maneuver of clambering into the LK from the Soyuz and then back again once they have docked. Speaking of, that is the maneuver that Anastasia is just about to do, having successfully taken the LK within a hair's breadth of the lunar surface and returning back to Felix's waiting arms in the orbital module. And then we do actually have to get Felix out on an EVA, partly to transfer the experiments that we had on the orbital module into the descent module of the Soyuz, so we don't lose them when we return to Earth, but also so I could show off the flags on the spacesuits, because I actually managed to find a way to get different flags on spacesuits for crew on the same mission. So the mission flag is the same, but the individual spacesuits are changed using texture replacer. So you can see we actually have a little Hungarian flag on Felix, and I was just kind of proud of that, so I wanted to show it off. So there we go. We do actually have the same thing on future Intercosmos missions, but this is the only example in this video, so I did just want to show that, you know, I put some effort into that, because it's kind of cool just seeing the different country flags on crew on the same mission. Regardless, with the experiments transferred across, we are now finished in lunar orbit, and we're going to perform a gentle deorbit burn just to send the LK flying into the lunar surface. The Americans are still in orbit, and although I'm sure N9 probably wouldn't try and rendezvous with Dave, he's messed with Sputnik 2 before, so if he had the fuel to do it, I'm sure he would, just for giggles. So I don't really want to leave our technology in easy reach for the Trinity 2 crew, so we're just gonna be better safe than sorry and slam it into the lunar surface, just in case. And then we're going to head back to the Earth. Now, it was a potential procedure for the lunar Soyuz, depending upon fuel reserves, to actually ditch the orbital module for the journey back to Earth, but we have more than enough propellant to get us back without jettisoning the only source of comfort and leg stretching for the 3-day journey. In fact, the Trinity 2 crew leave very shortly after us, so we're pretty much neck and neck and going to arrive back at Earth on the same day, which is just such a crazy coincidence that we're both in space and around the moon at the same time. Imagine if something like this happened in reality. Just how cool would that have been? If only the N1 had actually worked. Not that ours works that much better. Historically, we've had almost as many launch failures and 2 deaths actually caused by it, but still, a man can dream. Three days later, we arrive back at the Earth, and it's time to begin re-entry procedures. Now, similar to the Zond spacecraft, we have to perform a skip re-entry, so we slow down slightly, head back up into space, cool off a bit, and then head back into the atmosphere a second time. And that's just due to the Soyuz's rather limited re-entry survivability. This thing has to hit a target about 1 kilometer wide, altitude wise, otherwise it explodes. It either enters the atmosphere too steep and the crew get killed by G-forces, or it doesn't slow down enough, heads back on up and then heads back in and runs out of ablator because it's been exposed to a high heat load for too long. So it's a fairly narrow window we have to hit here, but thankfully we hit it right on the money, and the crew successfully survived the first phase of their re-entry, shortly followed by the second phase and a slow coast down to the water. I know people will point it out, so I am going to mention it. The thermal blankets on the lunar Soyuz descent module can't be removed. They can on the 7K Soyuz, but they don't burn off on this one. So sorry about that. A little bit unrealistic that they survived the heat of a lunar re-entry, but we move. Due to Leonid Kerman's dramatic cuts to peaceful scientific space exploration, Sergei Kerman has forged an unprecedented partnership with the newly formed European Space Agency. In exchange for a seat on the upcoming Soyuz 4 mission to low Earth orbit, Soviet delegates have been invited to visit the British Aircraft Corporation, where a joint venture with Aerospatiale is in development, a supersonic airliner named Concorde. With Soviet operatives managing to acquire select technical documents during their trip, the Tupolev 144 is rushed into becoming the world's first supersonic airliner to take flight. In a symbolic gesture, the maiden flight of the first production aircraft is to the United Kerbdom to pick up Jeffrey de Kerman and fly him to Baikonur Cosmodrome in record time for the upcoming Intercosmos mission. Yes, it's the Concordski, everyone's favourite janky supersonic airliner. I love this thing. It's just the most Soviet thing that ever Sovieted. In fact, my stepdad worked at BAC and worked on the Concorde, and as soon as he told me about it and used Concordski, which is what the BAC engineers referred to it as, I just thought that was the funniest thing I had ever heard. Because in the name of diplomacy, the UK government would invite Soviet quote-unquote delegates to visit the British Aircraft Corporation and just walk around the drawing offices. And the Soviets weren't stupid. They would send people with photographic memories who would be able to glance a technical document and then perfectly reproduce it. But the BAC engineers knew that. So what they did was they put out bogus design documents. So they put out designs for the landing gear using drum brakes, like a lorry. They also designed completely scuffed intakes that would never work. And then the Soviets actually copied them. And obviously, it didn't work. The Concordski was technically better than the Concorde in some ways. It could fly faster and it could carry more passengers, but the more primitive engines meant that it was so loud you couldn't have a conversation with someone sat next to you. It was deafening. Also, the double delta configuration of the wings rather than the beautiful camber you get on the Concorde means that it was only really good at flying supersonic. It couldn't really fly subsonic that well, so it had to use a braking parachute on landing, and also had two little moustache canards that extended out to aid in its subsonic low-speed stability. Really, the biggest shortcoming of the Concordski are the engine intakes. You can probably tell they're much longer than the Concorde intakes, and they weren't sophisticated enough to enable supercruise, which was like the secret weapon of the Concorde that allowed it to turn off its afterburners and maintain supersonic flight. As you can see, I'm trying to attempt that here, and much like the real-life Concordski, it's not capable of doing it. It has to burn its afterburners to maintain Mach 2.4. And because of that, its range is severely limited. Regardless, we still managed to fly the Concordski all the way over to the United Kerbdom, where we land at an undisclosed location and pick up Jeffrey de Kerman. And the following day, we take back off again and return to the Soviet Union, Jeffrey de Kerman sitting in the co-pilot seat. Unfortunately, a little disappointed that he can't make friends with Andrei Kerman because the engines are so loud they can only communicate by passing handwritten notes. I didn't actually fly this aircraft to the UK and back. I just flew it from Plesetsk, where I actually built it, over to Baikonur. And it was just able to do that. It just had the fuel capability to do so, which is actually pretty accurate to the range of the real-life Tu-144. It was pretty limited. It was only flown on one route between Moscow and Kazakhstan. It only flew for about a year with a regular passenger service before they stopped, because I think the concern about it potentially crashing and killing a plane full of people and the propaganda implications of that were pretty worrying to Soviet leadership, so they only actually used it to fly cargo and mail, of all things. But even then, a few of them crashed and exploded. I believe one of them crashed at a Paris air show in 1973, and then you had a cargo variant explode in 78 and another one in 1980. So yeah, not great. It wasn't really ever intended to be a successful aircraft. It was just to get the prestige of having had the world's first supersonic transport, which yes, they achieved. It's kind of astonishing that they managed to even get it done at all. But the cost of operating it, particularly in the Soviet Union, where you don't really have a niche upper class bunch of rich people that you can pitch it to, yeah, the economics don't really work out. But still, it does allow for Jeffrey de Kerman to get transported in style question mark to Baikonur Cosmodrome, and we did actually make the flight in game between Plesetsk and Baikonur in 80 minutes, which is pretty damn fast. Though we do require the entire length of the shorter runway at Baikonur to actually slow down, even with the aid of a drag parachute. And after having a few days to settle in, it's time to launch Jeffrey de Kerman aboard Soyuz 4, being piloted by none other than Valentina Kerman, at this point a veteran of the space program. The first woman that we put into orbit, not quite the first woman in orbit, she was beaten to that by Eileen Kerman from the United States, but she was one of the two Kerbals to first ever orbit the moon aboard the Sevier Lunar mission, which was a couple of years ago now. Crazy that lunar orbit flights are now becoming relatively routine. But Jeffrey de Kerman is really in the safest possible pair of hands here. We aren't actually carrying any science experiments on this flight, even though it is a relatively standard Soyuz flight profile, and that's because all of the tier 2 science experiments, which are carried by the 7K OK Soyuz, which is this Soyuz we're launching here, and the Voskhod, they all require at least 2 crew to do them, and well, ESA is only launching 1 crew. Valentina doesn't actually count towards any contracts or any experiments. It all has to be by the ESA astronaut. Also, we've decided that first contracts, so first crewed orbit, first moon landing, any contracts like that have to be completed by their own launch vehicle and their own spacecraft. But once Carnasa has achieved his own first crewed orbit, he could then complete crew contract on the Soyuz. But for example, if he put 2 crew onto the Soyuz and I had my 1 pilot aboard, he could only complete 2 crew contracts aboard, if that makes sense. So it's only for the number of crew that the agency actually has aboard that they can complete contracts and experiments for. Regardless, the flight goes off without a hitch, and Soyuz 4 is in a roughly 400 kilometer circular orbit. In fact, this is the final launch of the 7K OK Soyuz variant. Our next low Earth orbit Soyuz will be the 7KT variant, which has the next generation science experiments that are aboard our lunar Soyuz, which still have plenty of science to be gained in low Earth orbit. And they don't actually have solar panels, they're designed sort of as a space station ferry, so we'll be launching those once we've got some Salyut stations up, because they don't quite have the same level of endurance as the 7K OK with its solar panels. But that will of course be in future episodes, and to see the rest of Soyuz 4, you're going to have to head over to Carnasa's channel, because I handed the spacecraft over to him to control. The rest of the mission is in his video. And thankfully, Carnasa doesn't manage to kill Valentina or Jeffrey, even with minimal training or simulation using the 7K OK Soyuz. I didn't really give him much of a handbook or even tell him the action groups. I realized that's a bit of an oversight, so he didn't know how to fire the braking thrusters on landing. So Valentina probably lost a few teeth, but otherwise is unharmed, as they both touched down a few 100 kilometers away from Baikonur 2 weeks later. But that is the end of the episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you next time for a live stream of our first lunar landing attempt. A massive thank you to my patrons and donators for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to The Amazing Steak, Dakota Clark, Olaf Hammerhand, Lady Lagsalot, Madzor, Peter Lushtinets, Dennis Klomp, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Jesse Smith, Elmac, NX74656, and Starch.